So
Are we live?
I don't see us on YouTube just yet, but I have
So there will be the delay that I mentioned.
yes. Yep, we're live. Very good. Very good.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. So I think everything's going swell. Nice. Okay. Hi, everyone. Da, da, da. Great. And
So, for those of you who are just tuning in this week, I am the guest and Vincent is the host. So he is handling the logistics, and I just get to sit back and answer questions.
that's right. It is a little bit newish, I suppose, but I think everything's looking good, so we could go ahead and get started. And this is going to be fun because my name is Vincent. I'm the research advocate at Raza. Some of y'all have probably seen me before, but I get to introduce you, I guess, for the first time, which is kind of fun.
Yes.
So this is Rachael Tatman, Dr. Rachael Tatman, I guess I should say. And yeah, colleague in the research, in the developer advocacy team. We've been working together for about 2 years now. Rachael, you are based in Seattle at the moment, I think, right?
For now.
Yeah, at the moment. Because you're just about to move, I know, and I'm coming to you from Amsterdam, and I see that people are coming in from Jacksonville, Florida, which is just kind of exciting.
Nice.
So as people are sort of coming in right now, definitely feel free to ask questions. That's what we're here for. But just to get the ball rolling as well, Rachael, like, what have any things that you've been working on recently that are worth sharing to the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know how many of y'all follow me on Twitter, but I was recently promoted to staff, and as a staff developer advocate, I've been doing a lot of thinking about strategy and what we're going to do in the next 2 quarters and what the most urgent community needs. I know it's installation. I know that's the big issue everyone's having. Believe me, it's being raised. And how we can support that. And then just sort of generally what the future looks like and what I think the biggest, like what's going to be most effective for y'all, right? Like how can we help you get started faster, build cooler stuff, have a better understanding of the tricky things, and in particular the domain specific things. So specific things that I'm working on right now. No promises. I'm not going to say any dates, but I'm sort of planning and scoping, so TBD. I'd really like a course. So we right now have Rasa for beginners on Udemy that's not currently being maintained, and it takes about 2.5 hours to get through. And I would love a super condensed 1 hour getting started with Rasa course, because we also have the conversational AI with Rasa course on the Rasa Learning Center. That's I think learning.rasa.com, which is a great resource, but again, it's a little bit of a deep dive, so it takes a little bit longer to get through. So how can we get folks started faster? So that's a big thing I'm thinking about. And then another thing I've been really thinking about is maybe doing some sort of events on YouTube, like build-alongs, where we all build the same thing. There's going to be some fun events coming up from the DevRel team in the future, so keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. And then also on the product side, like what are, again, the most, like I don't make product decisions, but I do, I do pass on community feedback from y'all. And, I think right now the biggest pain point that I'm hearing about is certainly installation, and I'm bringing that up. And we also just launched on Monday a video on the YouTube channel for using the Raza ephemeral installer. So this is our new way to install Raza. And Henry from CSE worked on that with me, and it should be a walkthrough of how to get started installing Rasa X with the Rasa ephemeral installer. So it's not quite launched yet, just for Rasa open source, just for Rasa X. But of course, if you are installing Rasa X, you also install Rasa open source. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. We're working on a lot of stuff. There's a lot going on. I know that you see like the YouTube channel and the blogs, but underneath that, there's a lot of duck feet a pedaling.
Yeah, so
big info up.
That's it's always good to hear at least just how much work goes into making an open source product. Like I definitely remember before joining Raza, you kind of think like, oh, scikit-learn, it just kind of works, and then suddenly and scikit-learn does work, but it's because there's a huge community and so many researchers and like steering committees and stuff like that happening in the background.
Absolutely.
And similar things are happening with Raza, except that Raza has also this this added complexity that it also does machine learning, but it also comes with a web server, and all those parts have to sort of talk nice to each other. So definitely we hear you on the installation front. I might have something to share on the forum on that tomorrow as well, but we are definitely working on it.
Yes.
Definitely.
And of course, our community is a huge part of open source as well. So both our contributors, our code contributors, our docs contributors, people who run events and do things. So cheers, little coffee cheers.
Yeah, and also I guess I want to do like a little shout out as well, because last week there have been a couple of people making commits to Raza NLU examples. Like kind of nice and fun to maybe mention. Someone actually found a bug for Windows and fixed it. So nice. The flash text entity extractor, which basically allows you to say, here's like a million things I want you to match on, and I still want you to be fast. It's like, I think, factor 10,000 faster than the regex entity extractor. But that had a little bug for Windows encodings, and that's now been fixed. So also, if you're into sort of learning more about that, reach out to me. But it's been good to see some of these community PRs come in as well. It's been a really fun one to merge, I should say.
Yes, we are always we're always excited when we get contributions from new or old contributors.
And one thing I suppose about that in particular, we especially love hearing about non-English use cases. That's actually also what the repo is meant for, but especially if you're working on some non-English tools, we certainly appreciate any feedback. We definitely have a couple of languages represented at Raza, like certainly more than 10, but certainly not more. Well, how many languages are there? Rachel, I think you were
around 7,000.
Yeah, so we're not near that. So anyone with feedback is definitely more than welcome to supply it.
Yeah.
Great. So we have people coming in from India as well. That's definitely also very cool to see.
Yeah, we've got a lot of people working on Raza or using Raza from India. So
that's definitely awesome to see as well. So since there's no questions coming in just yet, I do have this other question that I'm just kind of curious about, Rachael. Because you've been working on a couple of pieces of content, especially like bots not to build.
Yes.
I thought it was a nice one. But one thing I kind of wonder, given that people want to, they want to get started with one of these assistants, if you were to sort of summarize, like, what's the number one maybe beginner thing that people sort of trip on, especially when it falls into the ethical assumption department? Because I can imagine, machine learning can be great, and people love to look forward and give it like a positive twist. But what would you think is like the main numero uno trap there?
Yes. I'm going to write down my thoughts, not with an X-Acto knife, really quick, so I don't forget them, because there's a couple. All right. So I think the most common mistake I see, particularly with beginners, is trying to force something into a chatbot that's not a conversation. So if you wouldn't already have a conversation to do it, don't try to build a conversational interface. I know that sounds a little bit, I don't know, maybe that sounds a little bit rude. It's not intended to be. Similarly, if there's something that, it would never make sense to put in a paper form, I probably wouldn't recommend using a web form for it, right? So sort of similar thing. So, round peg in a square hole sort of problem. So really a good couple examples there, I think, would be a great one is something like booking tickets. I find it extremely frustrating to book a ticket conversationally, because I want to know all the times that are available, right? I want basically, a table of data that I can look at, because I'm weighing a lot of factors in a way that are personalized to me, right? So I don't mind getting up early. So for me, an early flight is better than a later flight, or an early train is better than a later train. But that's not going to be universal. And if those decisions are just being quietly made behind the scenes, I get very frustrated, right? I want to know all the options, and I want to pick the option based on my particular criterion. So if something is not a conversation to begin with, or isn't good to have as a conversation, don't try to force it into a chatbot. That's not the right tool, right? The other really big problem I see is too many intents. So for prototyping, I personally would recommend no more than 10 intents maximum. And those should be the 10 things that someone is most likely to say to your chatbot. So there's this general rule, and we've talked about it in the channel before, in language use in general of zip fee and distribution. It's roughly a power law. Oh my God, can I remember? Can I remember the exact formal representation of a zip fee and distribution? Basically, what it says is that the most frequent item is significantly more frequent than the next frequent item, and so on. So you get this sort of exponential decay if you sort by frequency and then have count on the y-axis. And so when it comes to conversational turns that you have over a large enough sampling, if you bin all those conversational turns by intents, you should see sort of a similar kind of decay, right? The top n most frequent, 10 most frequent will cover the majority of the distribution, and the rest of the long tail don't bother with, particularly for prototyping. Particularly if people come to me and they're like, I'm seeing really long training times, or my bot's extremely slow. If you have, dozens and dozens and dozens of intents, that's a common issue for that. And then you asked about the ethical side. I think the main issue that I see there is more ignorance, right? Or, not knowing ethics, or also like the relevant legal stuff. So a good example there is financial advice. There's a lot of laws surrounding financial advice in the United States. Like, are you taking on the rule of a fiduciary? If you are, you need to work in your client's best financial interests. Do you know whether or not you're doing that, right? Like, is that a relationship that you are setting up unintentionally? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So really pick a domain you know well, or work with someone who knows that domain really well. Education is a great example. If you've never worked in education, if you don't have a pedagogical background, you're probably not going to do a very good job building a bot for an educational purpose. But if you work with an educator, they'll know the best practices, they'll know sort of like how students tend to misapprehend whatever it is that you're working with, and they'll be able to help you out. And then also, again, in the US, educational data in particular is protected under FERPA, so there's additional legal ramifications. So the three big things are A, trying to force things to be conversations when they're not conversations. B, having way, way too many intents, trim them back, focus on the most common things. And then C is, not having the domain knowledge you need. So, and you don't need to necessarily learn it unless you really want to, but work with somebody who does have that domain knowledge, and you will save yourself a lot of trouble.
Yep. All fair comments as far as I'm able to tell. In the meantime, I have started seeing some questions come in. I will start with the shortest question first. The question, which I'm assuming you've seen that one before on the channel. When will Rasa Open Source 3 start to support Rasa
X? Yeah. Soon TM. Yep. I believe it's currently planned for the next minor release. I cannot give you dates. I wish that I could. I don't want to lie to you, and we don't have them set in stone yet, but know that it is a very high priority and that we are working on it.
Yeah, for sure. There's a bunch of people working on it. That's also something that I can confirm.
Yes.
So definitely on the roadmap there. Then we've got a somewhat longer question from, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Amina.
Hey, Amina.
And she says, I'm using Postgres as a tracker store. I used MongoDB first, and then I switched to a relational database. But unfortunately, I have some data, and their type is JSON. Is there a way to handle this for all values, even though they don't all have the same length? So there sounds like a nested data structure where there might be some lists.
Yeah.
And then I asked for a little bit of clarification if there were details, and then we got this extra bit that says the connection was done perfectly, no problem. It's just that the format of the data, there are no errors, but I can't manipulate the JSON data in one column to calculate KPIs that I need because they need the children's children, etc.
That was going to be my first question is, do you need to actually interact with the JSON or just store it? Okay, so yeah.
So I could be wrong. Like I'm not the biggest Postgres expert, but I believe there's two settings. Like either the JSON is stored as a string, and in that case, yeah, that's going to be somewhat annoying. But I believe more recent versions of Postgres also support nested data structures, and in particular JSON. You might need to install a plugin in order to properly query it, though. That depends a bit on your Postgres distribution. I do know for SQLite, there's a tool called Dataset, like cassette, but Dataset, which comes with some JQ-like syntax, such as you can also do, some JSON stuff from the SQL terminal. I can't point you to like a precise package, but I imagine there has to be something like that for Postgres as well.
Yeah, I think that's going to have to be a question for, the particular data backend that you're using. Mixed data types are a pain in the ass.
Mixed data types definitely are tricky. One thing I do want to, I always feel like I want to defend Postgres a little bit. So I understand that people want to play around with different databases and, feel free to, right? Nothing is stopping you. But boy, Postgres has been around for a while. And a lot of kinks have actually gone out of that system. And I would argue it's probably one of the more robust databases out there. So definitely feel free to explore this further, but don't discount Postgres too much. It's actually a fairly decent database with a lot of features that are very likable.
I might actually post on Stack Overflow about this, possibly. I think the Postgres community is pretty active there, or search Stack Overflow first and see if you can find something about manipulating mixed data types in Postgres. I'd have to look it up, basically, is the answer to the question.
A final thing that's maybe worth mentioning as well is you could also wonder, if you're calculating KPIs, yes, there are benefits to having that in Postgres.
Does it need to be done in real time? Yeah.
But it doesn't need but I can also imagine it might be preferable not to do it on the database. It's actually running Raza at the same time. So what you might want to do instead is just do a text, dump it to a CSV or to a text file and just handle it offline instead. That might actually be more stable too. And then you can use whatever Python stuff you like. That might also just be of benefit.
Yeah.
But definitely, if you want to know more about the plugins in the Postgres ecosystem, I second what Rachael said. Stack Overflow is probably your first bet.
Yeah. And I would also, the reason I could see to do the KPI calculation real time in the chatbot is because you want people to be able to ask questions about it in the chatbot. At that point, if someone wants to do analytics via the chatbot and also use the chatbot to do the task you're doing analytics on, I'd build just a second chatbot.
Certainly something to be said for that as well. I hope this was useful, though. If it's not, feel free to continue asking more questions. Then we've got...
Also...
Oh, yes?
Oh, there's one more question. Markers might be useful here. I don't know if you're already using markers, but I'd recommend looking into them to see if you can attach your KPI to a specific marker, and then your life will just be easier.
And definitely markers are also a feature we'd love to get more feedback on. The researchers remind me on a somewhat frequent basis that they would love to get feedback on that feature. If you're interested, there is a tutorial that I did together with Asil that you should be able to find in the YouTube records as well. The next question is from Rick, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, Torzinski. And Rick has something exciting. Rick says that I'm giving a talk at a Florida Drupal camp next week in Orlando, Florida, on integrating Raza into a Drupal CMS website. I'm making a Drupal FAQ bot for a talk demo purpose, which should be a chatbot to answer very basic questions about Drupal, the CMS. Rick says that he did run into a slight difficulty because there are several versions of Drupal. Drupal 7, Drupal 8, Drupal 9.
Yes.
And
I already know how I'm going to answer this.
but there's also some abbreviations. So you got D8, for example, which is a common way to refer to a Drupal version. Rick says that there are no problems using D7 using synonyms and Drupal 7, but there is a difficulty in recognizing Drupal space 7 versus Drupal space 8. Rick tried using synonyms and lookups and is wondering if we might have some ideas.
So what I would do is I would, so you've got numbers in there, right? So I would use duckling to extract the numbers. And then I would, at the start of the conversation, ask what version they're using. And then either using, the entity you're extracting using, I'm assuming diet. So that would be like Drupal 8 or D8. And also potentially extracting a numeric entity, and then whichever one you get, mapping it to a slot that is just version. maybe a little bit hacky, but I believe that Duckling will also extract numbers that are not standalone, right? I think it'll extract numbers from strings, or you could use a regex entity extractor, which might just be easier. I might recommend that. And then for the answers to the questions, I would, for each of the questions, use a conditional response variable based on the, conversation-wide slot to pick the correct response. So I would probably, the more I think about it, the more I think regex is the way to go on this. So regex entity extractor, ask right at the beginning of the conversation, and then using the conditional response variables to pick the right answer would be my implementation there. I don't know if you do something dramatically different, Vincent.
Oh, certainly not. Regex, I think, is the way to go here. Like, part of me was thinking there might be some spacey tricks to do, but like regex is just going to be simpler. Like, start with that. There's some stuff you can do with validation, though. Like, if you detect the entire entity as like Drupal space 7, then you could have like a validation step afterwards, such that those two things are split and put into their own slots. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you could do there if you're so inclined.
I don't know that I would store the word Drupal in a bot about Drupal, right? Like, we know what the system is that they're asking about.
Yeah, that's true. No, so you're right. And so I'm thinking back at, like, I once wrote a bot that did programming languages, and then the programming language is actually super important, and the version number. Yes. But you're right. Like, if it's only about Drupal, like, I can imagine there might be plugins that you want to do there. So, like, depending on that. But you're right. Like, if it's definitely only about Drupal, then don't worry about Drupal. But yeah, regexes definitely are very flexible.
Also, send us a link to the bot when you're done. Tweet it at us. I want to see.
Yeah, definitely. We love seeing demos. And especially like good FAQ bots are always good to see. That's also something. Not every bot needs to be super fancy. FAQ is a very valid.
As someone who has had many Drupal questions, I would like to use it at some point, probably.
And Rick actually had a follow-up question on that. So Rick mentions that he is actually using regex, but that users might ask about different versions in a single conversation. But then I'm assuming different versions in a single utterance. I might be hearing there as well.
I think conversation makes sense, right? Because if I'm like, hey, how does Drupal handle
X? Yeah.
X. Okay, what about in version 9? Yes, great question. So I think you're going to want, in addition to, so I think what would happen, I think, so in that first slot, right, where you're setting what the version is in the slot, the response to that I would use as, I would have a specific intent that is providing Drupal version, right? And you'd have examples that are just like 7, 8, whatever, Drupal 7, Drupal 8, D8, D7, or like also examples like I actually meant Drupal 8, or I actually meant 7, or what about in 7, or what about in 8, etc. And that way, when they come up later on in the conversation, you can, when you specify how to set the slot, you can say that whenever you see this intent, whatever entity is extracted, that's how you. This is in Rasa 3. This is a Rasa 3 thing only. I'm going to preface this. If you're using Rasa 2, ignore the next thing that I say. But you can set it up so that whenever that intent is seen and whenever that entity is extracted, you reset that slot. So then the questions that people ask from there will continue to be on the same version. And I would also, when you ask people at the beginning of the conversation what Drupal version that they are using, I would say in that utterance from the assistant something like, what version of Drupal are you using? If you want to ask about another version later or set the version for the rest of the conversation, you can always say something like, can I hear about Drupal 8 or whatever your example is, so that people know that they have that sort of switch so they can flip. But I wouldn't have to make them specify every conversational turn, because if we're talking about Rasa 2 and then I switch to talking about Rasa 3, I expect that switch to continue until I explicitly switch it back, right? Just like as a conversational pattern that people have. And if you ask them to specify every single time, it's going to be annoying. Like I would stop using that chat bot. I'd be like, you should know this. I've already said it was 7 3 times. So that's my recommendation.
Yeah. So, yeah. Go ahead.
And also, just as an aside, this may have been your editorializing, but in situations like this where you're like, well, people might do something. If they do it, then you deal with it, right? In CDD. But I would say that's another pattern that I see to add to my list, is trying to handle all the things that people might do, because they might not do it at all, right? Like, who knows? What are people actually going to want to do with the chatbot?
So that was also like my final comment was a little bit in that direction as well, because part of me can imagine that I'm not too familiar with Drupal itself, but because it's a CMS, I can imagine that you get general questions about a CMS. And then if users don't really ask about the version number, but they have the general question like, hey, what is this feature of Drupal and how does that change across the versions? Then it might be more important that the version numbers make an appearance in the response than that you are able to handle them immediately in the beginning. Because none of the users use the version number in their question. Great. Depends, of course, on like the only way to know for sure is like look at your logs though. It's like that remains the main advice. So if you have evidence for that, definitely check that out. Rick continues by saying a couple of other things, which I also feel that will be good to mention is, yes, he's using Rasa 3. He gives us a compliment by saying, I love the graph pipeline for training.
Hell yeah.
Yes, lovely to hear that. And he also says, thank you, very helpful advice.
Glad we could help.
Our pleasure indeed. A couple of other questions came in. So another one from Amina. If we want to build a chatbot based on only on buttons with no written text to be allowed, in this case we can only use rules, right? Question mark.
I don't know enough about how buttons work right now off the top of my head to answer this. Do you know, Vincent?
Yeah. So the thing is, a button you can give a button a payload, which is the special Rasa syntax that you can use in the shell. It's like the / intent name, curly bracket, then entity values. So theoretically, a button press is nothing more than sending text that's like that. So a button press can imply a intent, and because intents can do stuff via the rule policy or the memorization policy or the TET policy. Theoretically, it's just like defining stories. Depends a bit on what you want the assistant to actually go ahead and do, though. I can imagine for many situations, just from a kind of more UI perspective, it is very much a button press. I want a certain response. But you can definitely do anything that stories could, theoretically. Same with entities. Now, whether or not this is pragmatic is a different story, of course, but buttons basically just deliver that payload. So you're still very flexible in that sense.
I think my main question there is less like, could you write a story for it? And more, you never want raw user text, right? In your example. And would it be potential, like my worry here is that using stories, you might potentially, depending on how your chatbot's set up, end up in a situation where you do have the opportunity for people to put in raw user text. Right. So just as a for instance, if you had like a goodbye intent and that got triggered, and you didn't have like a button for like say goodbye, then someone could just like enter the text and be like,
oh yeah,
something that would trigger a different intent. Right. So it's less like, could you do it? Yeah, you could. And more like, if you did do it, would you end up in a situation where you get the raw user text you're trying to avoid? I think my actual answer here is if you just want a button-based chatbot, you probably don't need Raza. I would use a different solution.
That's also certainly very fair. Probably the best answer. One thing that is also maybe good to mention, like if you're using the chatbot.js widget or like some of these other front-end tools, I think most of them don't come with an option to turn off text input. I could be wrong there, but there's a lot of these user interfaces that won't allow you to only render buttons. I think Slack also doesn't allow it, for example. So you are also heavily dependent on the UI of the framework that you're sort of pointing your bot to. Which is also definitely very good to just keep an eye on. There's a third question, and then we move on to Rishir. Right now, we can create multiple stories and rules with the same title. Is there a way to check this with Raza? It can be added in the data validation part, question mark. So I'll reread the question. Right now, we can create multiple stories
makes sense.
with the same title.
I think that the titles are like the language tag and that they are for you, the user, and Raza is not using them internally.
The title bit, yeah.
If you want that, I would do a feature request on the GitHub. I can see arguments for and against, right? And the argument for is that it can make it easier to read, and I don't know how the titles interact with the Rasa X interface, so that might be an issue there. In terms of like not having duplicate titles might make it easier to use Rasa X. I've never tried duplicate titles in a chatbot I was using with Rasa X. And then the big argument against is that it just like it adds some steps to data validation. It's going to be a little bit slower. I would file a GitHub issue for this. I don't know that it would break anything not to have it, but I also don't know that it's not good to have. That's my answer. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
Yeah, like I will say, like one thing I do, like when I'm working on a virtual assistant and I'm doing it in Raza, then part of me wants to just copy and paste some rules and copy and paste and just make some small changes. And then, the downside of doing this is that then, after a couple of weeks, you notice like, hey, there's all these rules with the same title. What's up with that? And that's because I forgot to clean up after myself. So I do think in general, it's a good thing to just take these titles serious because they help you later on in life. That's kind of the way I like to look at them. Structuring your data, like especially for the long term, is actually kind of important to do right away. Like I've heard myself in the past not taking that serious. That's the one thing I do want to maybe mention there. Okay, so now we've got someone else dropping by as well. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. Rushir Agarwal. He says, hi, I've recently started using Raza for FAQ chatbot for my organization. Got to know that the Rasa X previous version installation worked on Windows, but the major version now does not. Are there any specific reasons for this, and is there an easy hack available to make it work on the Windows environment?
Great question. So I think that in this case, the docs currently... Okay, to peel back the curtain a little bit, there's been a lot of discussion about this internally, and I think that the docs don't represent my current understanding of our product stance. So I know that with the current version of the Rasa X docs, it does not explicitly say that we support Windows. I believe that the plan is to explicitly support Windows, and that we have not updated the docs to represent that difference. So the current version for installing Rasa X, the current method for installing Rasa X is that Raza ephemeral installer. I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I don't know if you had tuned in then yet or not, but we have a video from Henry on our CSE team that we worked on together. It's up on the YouTube channel walking you through that process. But my current understanding is that we do support Windows because we know that it is the second most common operating system that our developers use, and about 2/3 of y'all are on Windows. Also, I'm on Windows, so I feel your pain. So yes, I think that the docs do not currently represent my understanding of our current product stance, but there's been so many discussions about this. Yeah. I don't know. I hope that's helpful. I know it's a little bit confusing, but I am also a little bit confused, but I think that's the current state.
The only thing I have to add to that is if you go to the Rasa X documentation, you can still find the old versions listed there. There's like, if you go to the right-hand side, a little bit to the bottom, like in that little side pane, there's a version number. You can click that, and you should also be able to go back a couple of version numbers there. Should that be helpful if you're still working on like an older version? In particular, I would say in general in software development, you want to keep your stuff up to date, because otherwise, like a big upgrade might hurt in the future. But not being on top of the latest and greatest is not necessarily like an awful thing. If something works, that's also sometimes fine. But that's like one thing I always also like to just mention. Like you shouldn't feel bad if you're not upgrading to the most recent and latest and greatest all the time. Rushir has actually replied. He should have said earlier that the training videos from Rachael were very helpful to get started with Raza. Thank you! ! So thanks for that. Compliments are always definitely welcome.
Glad I could help.
Amina came with question number 4 now. Usually when there's a new version of a quote-unquote tool, you wait a little bit to see if it will be stable or if it's matured enough before switching. She mentioned this is very common for open source.
Absolutely.
How much do you think one should wait?
That's a great question. So we do, before we push, like for example, 3.0, before we pushed it live, we actually did quite a bit of testing and feedback. So if you're a Rasa contributor, you know that we have a Slack for contributors. So people who have worked with Raza in some capacity, and we worked quite a bit with the contributor community to, test and make sure everything worked. So the hope is that, when a major version is launched, it should be good to go. But of course, we can't, I would never promise you bugless code. Anyone who does is lying to you. Don't trust them. And if you're worried about it, I would say maybe like a month. Because we're open source, you can, for Raza open source, you can go and you can look through the GitHub issues and see like, what's a major issue, see, what the team said, how it's been triaged, are multiple people having it, or is it like one person on like one version of, Red Hat who's running into issues or something. Yeah. So personally, by the time that a major version of Raza open source goes live, I personally feel good about using it for my projects. If that's not true for you, that's also okay.
I mean, especially if you have like if you're representing a company and they have like users that are to some degree like dependent on the assistant, it's perfectly fine to just be a little bit conservative as well, because people might be bothered and you want to prevent that. So like that's good reason to be conservative. Another thing that is always possible as well is this is not so much Raza, but like in the past with scikit-learn, like I maintain a couple of open source projects. I sometimes like to just make a separate Docker container with the most recent versions of all the dependencies that I have. Just to
regression testing.
Yeah, so just to see if stuff will break. And that's actually, this might be a fun one. This is not something that you will notice directly, but one of the PRs that I made a while ago is for a cron job. So GitHub Actions inside of Raza now, we will try to install Raza, the most recent version of it, but also with some of the more recent dependencies, where the goal is that we might want to detect this early if something breaks. It's not a perfect. Well, so I think also here the goal is not to be perfect. It's not going to be a perfect system, but if we catch like one bug a month this way before some of our users do, we like that. So that's one of the reasons why we're experimenting with this way of testing now as well.
Yeah. And I would also say something to consider is migration time. So particularly if you have a mature assistant that's relying on features that are going to be deprecated, or if you had, for example, a very complex pipeline architecture and are trying to switch from 2 to 3, you might need to invest, extra engineering time in developing your own graph. So yeah, it's considering the time sync for an upgrade is definitely non-trivial. And I don't know, just as a general rule of thumb, I try to do it during whatever your slow time is for your business, just generally. And make sure that you've got very robust regression tests.
And on that note, it was like the final thing that also popped into my mind just now. Before doing a migration, that's also like an excellent point in time to just have a sit with some colleagues and just think like, hey, what are we afraid of? And do we have tests for that? Like if there's ever a good time to just add a couple of extra tests just to be sure, just in case, it's right before you do a migration.
Yes.
Definitely worth every time I did it, worth every penny of that I put into that.
The best time to add tests is last year. The second best time is now.
Yes. And by the way, you can also do that for custom actions. By the way, you can have some PyTests. Like if you have a custom class that's using a function, just run.
You should be testing all of your custom actions.
Yes.
we encourage good test coverage here at Raza.
Yes. And if there's any specific questions about how to do that, feel free to ask. But I figured I'd mention it. So we've answered that question. Now there's a couple of extra coming in. So there's one now from Nick. Hi Rachel. Hi Vincent.
Hey Nick.
Hi Nick. When rules are useful and when are stories more useful? So this is more of a comparison to those two.
Yeah. So sorry, that's my thinking face. I'm trying to think of the quickest, most condensed way to say this. So stories are helpful when you want to have more flexibility in what happens next, right? Most of your conversational data should be in stories. So for those of you who haven't worked with stories deeply or aren't super familiar with how they're used by Raza internally, and we have a blog post coming that's going to go into way more detail, soon, TM. The way that it works is stories are example conversations. If someone is using your chatbot and the pattern of conversation is exactly following one of those example conversations, it will just follow the example conversation. So what if what you're looking for is the behavior where, Chatbot says X, user says Y. Chatbot says X sub 1, user says Y sub 1, and you want to always have that same pattern. You get that for free by giving stories. The benefit of stories is that we can then also use them to train TED and guess what to say next. So if somebody's following this pattern and then they suddenly have a digression, right? So let's try, they're booking a flight and they're like, wait a second, do I need a visa, right? And you need to refer to another story, you can do that. And then if the person's like, okay, great, thanks for answering my visa question, what times do you have available on Saturday, you can come back to the main flow of the story. Rules cannot handle regressions. So I would say you should use rules for very small pairs of turns, right? So like chatbot says something, user says something, that would be, inserted or reused a lot. So a great example of this is user says goodbye, chatbot says goodbye. It's always going to be like that. You always want it to happen that way, no matter where it happens in the conversation, right? Or user says, are you a chatbot? Chatbot always says, yes, I'm a chatbot powered by Raza, or whatever you've written for your particular bot response. And that happens, just like that, always anywhere in the conversation. So rules are helpful for handling like a specific digression or a specific very common pattern where it's always going to be exactly the same. Stories are the core of what makes Raza work, right? They are how you provide training data so that a chatbot can handle digressions, so it can handle, flexible, different conversations. Also, not all stories have to be from the start of the conversation to the end of the conversation. They can be sort of like chunks and patterns that you expect to happen within a conversation. You'll probably generate your first couple just yourself, based on existing data or working with domain experts. And then the rest should be ideally taken from actual user data using conversation-driven development.
It's a smooth wink there. No, perfect explanation, I think. A lot of other questions have started popping in, so I am gonna switch to make sure because we haven't got too much time left. So
rapid fire.
Yes. So someone is asking the training video that Rachael mentioned earlier. Will it be shared? I tried to find it real quick. I couldn't find it right now, but I'll make sure it's in the show notes after.
It's in the installations.
Okay.
It's called something like installing and deploying Rasa X using the Rasa ephemeral installer. It will be the most recent video on our YouTube channel. It's got white text on a purple background.
If it's in the tutorials, it's in the tutorials playlist, right? Okay, then I'll...
Installations, not tutorials.
Installation guides, that's the one. And I should be... Okay, I'll give that a quick glance a bit later because there's some other questions as well, but that will be in the show notes real quick. Then the docs state that Windows Rasa X Enterprise is developed for Linux-based systems. The software does not run on Windows and there are no plans to add support for it. I believe this is what we mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Our impression is that might change, but for now, this is what is indeed listed on the docs.
Yes, I believe that the docs currently do not reflect my understanding of the current product state. Is where we're at on this. If you have specific enterprise questions, I would reach out to our sales team. They'll be able to give you answers.
Very true. So yeah, that's the question about that. Then we have a new question coming from Chris Luigi Tails.
Hey, Chris.
I basically write very simple intent action rules and then build stories using interactive learning, or just write them if I think they're really simple. What do you think of that approach?
Great. Works great.
Yep. Totally agree. I think the interactive learning part of the Raza open source toolchain is one of the most underused, lovely features that we have. Honestly, I use it all the time for debugging. For those of you who have not used interactive learning, the way it goes is you start your browser server, Raza Interactive, I believe is the CLI, and then you just have a conversation with the chatbot, and that conversation is stored as training data. Pretty much. And there's some fancy things that you can do at the end as well. But basically, like a new story will appear in your stories file. If you've made any new utterances, the NLU file also automatically gets updated. So all of that's pretty fancy. But some of the stuff that's also just kind of nice, if you make use of that interface, you're also going to see like the predicted scores. So you're going to say like, hey, the assistant thinks that this is the confidence for the intent, and this is the confidence that we have for the policies. And in my case, for example, I'm also sometimes helping out the research team. I remember a while ago we were checking like, hey, when is the fallback classifier actually triggered, and can we sort of play around with that to understand it? Confidence in machine learning is a very hard topic, it turns out. Totally an unsolved problem. Like, completely, it's very easy to underestimate it. But having that tool is great because you can basically poke around. And what's also really cool is there's a nice little undo button. So usually if you have a conversation and you might be 5 steps in, you don't want to start all the way from scratch. But there's this Command Z, there's an undo functionality in there as well. Super neat to play with, especially for rapid prototyping on my local machine. It's the best.
Yeah. So good development practice, Chris, and I would encourage other folks to try it out if you haven't already.
Yep. And if I can be specific, I think one thing that not a lot of people might do, but something I very much enjoy doing, is I really try to break the assistant when I'm doing the interactive shell. Like, I really try to say hello, like, in a very different way every single time. And I'm always kind of like pushing to see where I can get the assistant to break. That exercise tends to be quite educational as well. And I also try to be reasonable. Like, obviously there are some things I can do that would totally break the assistant, but like I try to be figuring out what the limits are of what the assistant can handle, and understanding that is also something that the interactive tool helps with. Then we've got another question from Amina asking, Rachel, you won't be doing these office hours anymore? ?
Okay, so I hope I didn't freak anybody out. This is my last day at Raza before I take a break and then come back. So I'm moving across the United States basically, and I won't be here. So I will be back early March. Do not worry, the office hours will be taken by my wonderful colleagues. So Vincent's going to take a couple, and then Eustace is going to take a couple. Eustace is our head of DevRel. You may recognize her from the masterclass. She's fantastic as well. So the office hours are still going to happen. I will be back, but I'm not going to be online while I'm, driving across the United States with like my dog and a trunk full of stuff and trying to figure out logistics. And I don't know when I'm going to have Wi-Fi, so I shan't be here, but I'll be here in spirit.
Yes, and for the next 2 weeks, this is also me. So the reason why I'm here is also so I get a little bit of practice in this streaming stuff. It might look easy on the YouTube side of things on your end, but as both me and Rachel can confirm, like a lot of stuff actually have to hook up, and so I'm very thankful that Rachel's around for like the supervision here. But I'll be around right now, and the next 2 weeks I'll be doing that together with 2 of my colleagues who are a little bit more in research and in machine learning engineering as well. So if you're interested in those topics, definitely feel free to drop by.
Absolutely.
Then there's a couple of other questions. So Nick had a question earlier about why, any comments why Docker installation for Rasa X is not part of, I think Docker Compose is what they are referring to. So
Docker
the question
Compose
is,
specifically, yeah.
Yeah, so any comments on why Docker installation for Rasa X is not part of the Rasa X latest? And there's a follow-up question, if we are only working on Rasa open source, ?
Good question. I don't off the top of my head remember the rationale for the Docker Compose deprecation. But as I recall, there was some pretty significant issues that were just like not workaroundable. So the Rasa ephemeral installer that we mentioned briefly uses Kubernetes, which is built on Docker. So it still is like technically Docker. It's just like there's more. I mean, it's not like magic, right? It's open source, but like there's more magic that happens behind the scenes to make it a little bit, hopefully, more automated, more robust, easier to redeploy. That's the goal. I hope that we do it.
If you're interested in learning more about that, there's a course on the Learning Center which is titled Understanding Raza Deployments that also discusses a little bit why the choice for Kubernetes is made. And one of the points that is made there is, in general, Docker Compose, it's pretty cool if you're working on a single VM, but it doesn't scale, and in a way, it's also kind of brittle. Like, if that one machine goes down, Docker Compose is not going to be able to help you. And Kubernetes, in this case, if you get like an influx of traffic, it can still handle that just because of the way that Kubernetes is set up. If you want to learn more, understanding Rasa deployments might be a very interesting course for you. And also, like the complete rationale behind the deprecation, I can't say, but one thing I do want to maybe mention that is becoming a theme, at least in some of the minds of our engineers, is we have started thinking about like, we can try to support every single deployment option out there. We can think of Cloud Functions maybe even. But the problem is that then, the area that we got to cover and make sure that nothing breaks becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And since, especially for like proper deployments that need to handle a lot of traffic, Kubernetes seems to be the de facto way of doing it.
For scaling, yeah.
There is definitely a preference to make sure that enough effort is on that. And if we can make that the standard, that's kind of a great thing. And that's also what the end goal of the ephemeral installer is. The hope is that where before you would use Docker Compose because it's a single command to run on a single VM, you might be able to achieve the same thing by just running Kubernetes on a single machine. And we can then provide like an official Rasa installer that is also like a single command, basically, which should offer the same convenience. Work in progress, though.
And I will say for Rasa open source, if you feel strongly that you want Docker Compose, like it's open source, you're perfectly welcome to work on that.
No one is stopping you. Don't forget the action server.
Yes, don't forget the action server, definitely.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And also, I have done this in the past. Just made my own Docker Compose with my own little Docker container because that way it worked exactly the way that I wanted it. It totally works. Deserves to be said.
And while Vincent catches up, I just like for context here, there's Rasa assistants that are handling millions of queries a day. So we have to think about supporting scale, like not just like, a little bit of scale, but like a lot of scale and like very big assistants. And like, how can we support that and also have something that works for, people who are working on hobby projects or just like smaller stuff as well, which is not an easy problem, very challenging.
We're nearing time even more, and there's more questions coming in. So there's question number 5 from Amina. Do we write test stories for everything? Means every rule and every story? How to choose which test to do when you're writing a somewhat complicated chatbot?
Great question. What is the specific core functionality that has to work? Those are the conversations to test. So if you're working from something like a PRD, a product requirements docket, product requirements doc, right? Where someone who is like the person who asked you to build the chatbot basically is like, here's the things I want the chatbot to do. You should have a test for all the things the person wanted the chatbot to do. You don't need to test every single little thing, but there should be like, if this breaks, it's a red alert. That should be in your tests. And I would just recommend like a bunch of end-to-end conversations that cover the most common things that you expect people to do. It's a good question.
Yeah. If I can give a small hint there, so for sure, test the stuff that's important first and foremost. But it's sometimes, like in general software development, it sometimes helps to think ahead. What do I want to see if I'm trying to debug this? Like, how can I help myself in the future figure out what's really going wrong? And we kind of come back to like the title stuff. Like it helps to have a really descriptive title attached to like some of these stories as well. But it also helps to think a little bit about like, hey, should something go wrong in the future? What sort of tests would I like to have around just so I can debug? Another thing is if something ever were to go wrong in production, I think one of the coolest things to do right away is add a test, just to make sure this will never happen again. Just some extra advice. Writing proper tests is not a solved problem either, but it helps to like maybe take a step back and reflect a little bit once in a while. And that's like the final snippet of advice. Then we have a question from Arctan. I tried to install Rasa lit, but it throws errors. Type error, a bytes-like object is missing, not string, what am I missing? That's a question for me, I think. I wrote Rasa lit a while ago. One thing to keep in mind is that currently Rasa lit doesn't support Rasa 3. There's a couple of features in there that are kind of specific to Rasa 2, which is why we haven't really decided to upgrade it just yet. So the error that you see might be related to just that. It's because Rasa lit is unaware of the graph architecture. It's kind of hard to know for sure though, but if you just open a GitHub issue, I will be able to have a look and might be able to help you further.
It could also potentially be an encoding issue based on that error. Sure. If you're trying a language that has like a lot of non-ASCII characters. Potentially. Possibly.
Yeah, definitely possible. But to know for sure, I would need to investigate just a bit more. Yeah. And then we're getting some compliments in, by the way. That's always nice to see. And again, I hope that I pronounced it correctly. Surendra Gupta is saying, thanks for the live session. I found Raza very well. And in case issues, we have Nick to solve super fast. Thanks, Vincent, Rachel, for the videos.
Nick is fast on the forums.
Nick definitely beat me to it a bunch of times. Thank you, Nick. And then there's a bunch of people saying safe travels, Rachel.
Thank you.
Glad to hear that you will be back. Enjoy your break and can't wait to have you back. Someone is asking east to west or west to east.
West to east, so I'm going to be closer to Europe, which will make my life substantially easier. Some of you may know I'm from Virginia, so I'm moving home.
And also I think it's also fair to mention it's nice to have a company that's a little bit more remote, with people across the world. I think that's nice because, interesting coffee conversations, people have seen different parts of the world, all that stuff is great. But the time difference definitely in a thing when you're working remotely, and Rachel definitely lives in a different time zone. So the DevRel team is of course happy to see Rachel move to where she wants to live, but it's a nice little bonus that the time zone issues are gonna become smaller.
I don't have to lead any more meetings at 7:30 a.m., which I am very excited about.
But and also being closer to family has its benefits too, right?
Yeah.
I live in the Netherlands, so the distance that Rachel is traveling just to move is astronomical to me.
Yes.
Yeah, but yeah, thanks for those kind questions. So Nick has said, on the forum, people trying Rasa X using Docker Compose only, and it's giving result also.
Yeah, I mean it's deprecated as a installation technique. I would point them towards the Rasa ephemeral installer, and then in Rasa X, in the forum thread, I don't think I pinned it, but I also posted the video for the Rasa ephemeral installer example, and then in the comments of that forum post, there are also the instructions that Henry typed out. So hopefully that'll be a nice little quick start for folks.
I guess a final thing that might also be good to mention there. So one of the reasons why I enjoyed using Docker Compose was just you don't have to install Kubernetes. It's kind of just easy to get started with. So if you're building a quick demo and you want to put something on the web on a VM, Docker Compose seemed like a fairly easy option. And part of that's true. But I might also consider if you're really just going for a demo, you can also just run Raza on the VM. And I've actually found that to be quite convenient too. Especially if you're still in the rapid prototyping phase, just typing Raza run -- enable API can already be good enough, at least to host the NLU server and to sort of, it won't scale, right? That's something to be aware of. And the tracker store is probably going to be either in memory or SQLite. Keep all of that in mind. But for getting started, you don't even need Docker. That is something just also deserves mentioning. Then a couple more compliments. So the person who was asking about Raza Lit was using Raza 2, is going to make a GitHub issue and is giving a compliment because it seems like a great tool and the person's really looking forward to use it. The GIFs on the README do give a cool impression of stuff that you could do with the tool. So thanks for that. Anima says, thanks for this video. It's always helpful to see you. She's looking forward to seeing us next week. And then Surendra Gupta is saying there's only Docker Compose related Rasa X installation in the docs. I think you're looking at an older version of the docs then.
You might be, yeah.
If you could type the version that you are working on right now, that might be able to help us. I do know that there are still some people running Rasa 1.x somewhere, and I can imagine that those docs, people still use them. I really recommend upgrading to at least version 2 at this point, but I can also imagine that some of the installation guides might be different for that version. So that might be it. Could be wrong, but then it seems like we are nearing time. Nick says thanks to us as well, so happy to hear it. Thanks, Vincent, Rachael. But since we're closing in on time, I guess the main thing that's left for me to say is thanks, Rachael, for doing all these videos, and hope you have a great break traveling across the country, moving. I know it can be super duper stressful, so I'll be,
Yes.
But I'm sure you're going to have a little bit of a blast as well because you're bringing your dog as well on the road trip. So I'm sure there'll be adorable photos on Twitter once in a while. Rachael has the cutest dog. If you haven't seen Benson yet, Benson's amazing. So yeah, Rachel, I really hope that the moving is not going to be too bad for you, and that you hope
Thank you.
that you enjoy the road trip. For everyone else, thanks for tuning in. Again, we'll be back next week. If I recall correctly, next week I'll be here with Felicia. She's one of our researchers. She's great. And the week after, we'll be here with Matt. He's been working on some of the TensorFlow integration stuff. So if you're interested in some of those details, definitely feel free to tune in as well.
I know, so we all got TensorFlow questions.
Yes. And you can totally ask them to Felicia as well, by the way. Like, Felicia's also been working on that. But both have been working on getting TensorFlow to work and can tell you some of the naughty details. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you all